Mouse River Bottoms, North Dakota, August 1898. The air was thick with the late summer drone of insects and the smell of cut hay curing in the fields. On the vast flat floor of the prairie, where every structure fought for definition against an overwhelming sky, Bohdan Hrytsenko was building something that made no sense. It was not a cabin. It was not a barn. It was a squat, rising cone of green oak logs, a primitive ziggurat taking shape under the relentless sun. He worked alone, his broad back bent to the task. Each log, still heavy with sap, was manhandled into place, its thick butt end settled into the packed earth, its tip angled inward to meet a point that did not yet exist. It was a slow, brutal architecture of leverage and muscle. Neighbors on their way to town would slow their wagons, watch for a minute, and shake their heads before moving on. Hollis Pemberton, the quartermaster from Fort Totten, stopped his horse for a longer look. He was a man who understood structures in terms of board feet and right angles, of milled lumber and predictable loads. He saw waste. He saw failure. With him was Jedediah Mills, a trapper whose face was a roadmap of hard winters. "What in God's name is the Galician building?" Pemberton asked, more to the sky than to Mills. "A burial mound for his whole family?" Mills spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Damnedest thing I ever saw. He's using green oak. That wood's gonna twist and shrink 6 ways from Sunday. The whole foolish thing will pull itself apart before the first snow." The word spread through the settlement like a grass fire. The quiet Ukrainian, the newcomer who kept to himself, was not just eccentric, he was dangerously crazy. What did this Galician shepherd carpenter, this man from the deep forests of the Carpathian Mountains, understand about thermal mass and geometry that a seasoned Fort Totten quartermaster, an expert in supplying an army against the Dakota winter, had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn about the forgotten physics of shape and the immense power of a thermal battery. Principles that allowed a family to live in shirt sleeves while the world outside fell to 70 degrees below zero. If you've ever seen an old world solution that seemed strange but worked brilliantly, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Bohdan Hrytsenko was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, nor was he a carpenter in the American sense of the word. He was a Hutsul, a man of the mountains, and his hands knew a different set of materials. They knew the greasy resilience of sheep's wool, the precise heft of a broad-bladed axe used for shaping the interlocking timbers of a coliba, a shepherd's hut designed to withstand the crushing snows of a Carpathian winter. His senses were calibrated to the smell of river clay being mixed for a stove, the resonant tap of a stone against a drying plaster wall, the deep, silent cold of a mountain pass. He had come to America with his wife Katerina and their 2 small children, Ivan and Oksana, drawn by the promise of land. They were given a plot in the Mouse River Bottoms, a place whose flatness was as alien to him as a desert. They had arrived too late in the season to build properly, throwing up a standard square-hewn log cabin in a desperate race against the coming cold. That first winter of 1897 had been a lesson written in ice. It was a kind of cold he had never known, a cold with teeth and a voice. It was not the heavy, silent cold of his mountains. It was a thin, screaming cold, carried on a wind that never, ever stopped. The memory of it was a physical ache. He remembered the inkwell on his small writing desk tipping over, the black fluid not spilling but standing frozen in the air for a moment before clattering to the floorboards like a dropped acorn. He remembered the breath of their single horse, stabled in the lean-to, freezing into a solid, shimmering curtain on the stall slats, a tapestry of pure misery. He remembered Katerina reaching for the bar of soap on the washstand, and the lye and tallow brick splintering in her hand as if it were glass. They had survived, but only just. They had burned through their entire woodpile by February. and then the fence posts, and then the spare boards meant for a larger barn. The children had slept in their coats for 3 straight months, their coughs a constant shallow percussion in the dark. Bohdan had failed them. His cabin, built to the exact specifications of his neighbors, was a trap. It was a wooden sieve that let the heat out and the killing cold in. He swore he would not face another winter like that. He would not build what they built. He would build what he knew. The problem with the American log cabin was not its material. It was its geometry and its philosophy. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was built on speed and right angles, 4 walls, a flat roof, and a large fireplace. It was a design imported from the milder climates of Ohio and Pennsylvania, a design wholly unsuited for the brutal physics of a North Dakota winter. The primary failure was the north wall. On the prairie, the winter wind is not a visitor. It is a permanent resident, a river of Arctic air flowing down from Hudson Bay. A flat, 20-foot-long north-facing wall acted like a ship's sail, catching the full, relentless force of that wind. This maximized convective heat loss, the process of moving air-stripping heat from a surface. Every gust that slammed into the cabin wall was like a thief, stealing precious BTUs of warmth and carrying them away into the frozen expanse. The chinking, a mixture of mud and grass, would shrink and crack, opening up hundreds of tiny fissures for that wind to knife through. Inside, a family like the Finches, on the next section over, fought a losing battle. Abner Finch spent his days feeding their cast-iron stove, a roaring monster that consumed cottonwood logs at an astonishing rate. Yet 10 feet away from the stove, the air was frigid. Ice grew in thick, opaque ferns on the inside of the window panes. The walls themselves were cold to the touch, constantly pulling warmth from the bodies of his children, who huddled together under a pile of quilts. The cabin was a thermal sieve. For every cord of wood Abner burned, perhaps 80% of the heat went straight up the chimney or directly through the walls, lost to the indifferent landscape. He was heating the prairie, not his home. The design forced a constant, desperate war against the cold, a war of attrition that consumed fuel, energy, and spirit. It was a structure designed to be ambushed. Bohdan's construction was the opposite. It was a fortress of physics, designed not to fight the wind, but to ignore it. The foundation was a simple 18-foot square, dug a foot into the prairie soil. He began laying the green oak logs, not horizontally, but vertically. The heaviest, thickest butt ends were settled onto the packed earth, creating a massive, stable base. Then, with a block and tackle rigged to a temporary central pole, he began tilting them inward. Each log leaned against its neighbor, the weight distributing inward and downward, until they met at an apex 16 feet above the floor. It was the shape of a mountain, the most stable form in nature. Silas Croft, the man who ran the small local sawmill, came by to watch. "You're making a mistake with that green oak, Hrytsenko," he advised, his voice filled with genuine concern. "It's holding more water than wood. When the freeze comes, that water will expand, and when the spring thaw hits, it'll shrink by a good inch on its diameter. It's going to open up gaps you can throw a cat through." Bohdan paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked at the sawyer, a man who knew cut and dried lumber, and nodded. "It will shrink," he said, his English still thick with the cadence of his homeland. "It will tighten." He then turned back to his work, the conversation over. The wooden pyramid was just the skeleton. The real work began with the mud. For weeks, he and Katerina hauled buckets of clay from the banks of the Mouse River, mixing it with water in a shallow pit and stomping in straw from the recent threshing. It was an ancient recipe, a primordial concrete. They began applying it by the handful, forcing the thick, sticky cob into every crevice between the logs, building it up layer by layer. The mockery from the community intensified. It was no longer a strange wooden cone. It was a mud pile. Hollis Pemberton made a special trip out from the fort. He was responsible for the welfare of the soldiers, and by extension, the settlers in the fort's sphere of influence. He saw a public hazard in the making. He walked the perimeter, tapping the slowly drying wall with his knuckles. He looked at Bohdan, who was smoothing the surface with a wet hand. "That green oak is going to settle, Hrytsenko. I've seen it 100 times, Pemberton stated, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "Those logs will compress under the sheer tonnage of this mud. The cob will crack. It won't just fissure. It'll come off in sheets, great heavy slabs of it. It'll come down on your family while they sleep and crush them. This thing is a death trap." It was the most direct and serious accusation yet, a technical objection rooted in sound, conventional knowledge. Bohdan met his gaze. He did not argue. He did not defend. He simply stated a fact as he knew it. "It will settle," he repeated, his voice calm. "It will tighten." Katerina watched them from the doorway, her hands covered in drying clay. She had her own private concerns, but her trust in her husband was absolute. When he was finished with the final layer, she walked around the strange structure that was to be their home. It was massive, sloped, and utterly alien on the flat prairie. "It looks like a great sleeping beast, Bohdan," she said, a hint of awe in her voice. The final layer of cob brought the walls to a thickness of 24 inches. For the last week of summer, Bohdan did something that baffled everyone. He spent his days rubbing the entire surface of the mud pyramid with a smooth, heavy river stone, back and forth, until the straw-clay mixture took on a dull, burnished sheen, as smooth and hard as pottery. He was sealing it, closing every microscopic pore against the coming wind. To understand why Bohdan's mud pyramid worked, you have to forget everything you know about a conventional cabin. He wasn't building insulation, he was building a battery. A thermal battery made of 20 tons of earth. The science behind it was a combination of two powerful principles, geometric shedding and thermal mass. First, the geometry. A standard 18-foot square cabin with 10-foot walls presents a flat 180-square-foot surface to the north wind. This wall is a target. The wind hits it squarely, transferring its kinetic energy and scrubbing away heat. Bohdan's pyramid, with the same 18-foot base, had no flat walls. Its sloped sides presented a fundamentally different profile to the wind. The angle of the logs meant that the north-facing surface area was a triangle, not a rectangle. The math is simple and brutal. The pyramid shape presented 32% less surface area to the wind. But more importantly, the wind didn't hit it. It flowed over it. Like water off a ship's prow, the Arctic air was deflected up and around the structure, its velocity preventing it from lingering and stealing heat. It gave the wind nothing to push against. Second, and most critically, was thermal mass. The 24-inch thick walls of straw and clay were not meant to stop the cold in the way that a wool blanket does. A wool blanket is insulation. It traps air and slows heat transfer. Bohdan's wall was different. It was a massive reservoir. Throughout the day, a small, efficient fire of cottonwood burned inside the pyramid. The heat from that fire, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, didn't just heat the air. It soaked into the immense mass of the clay walls. For hours, the walls absorbed energy, like a stone absorbs the sun's heat. By nightfall, when the fire was banked to smoldering coals, the physics reversed. As the small pocket of air inside began to cool, the tons of heated clay began to radiate their stored energy back into the room. It was a slow, steady, even release of warmth that lasted for hours. The card from the original study notes it could continue releasing stored heat for over 18 hours. The walls themselves became the stove. This process created an astonishingly stable interior climate. The temperature inside barely fluctuated, regardless of the maelstrom outside. When you combine these two effects, the result is a staggering leap in efficiency. The standard measurement for heat loss in a structure is its U value. A lower U value is better. A typical well-chinked log cabin in 1898 had a U value of around 0.25. Bohdan's pyramid, with its wind-shedding geometry and its massive thermal battery of a wall, had a calculated U value of approximately 0.05. It was, in thermal terms, 5 times more effective than the best conventional cabin on the prairie. He wasn't fighting a war of attrition against the cold. He was simply sidestepping the battle altogether. That November, the sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. The wind swung around to the north, and the real winter arrived. It came not as a gentle snow, but as a continental event, a vast lobe of Arctic air breaking free from its polar prison and surging south. They called it a Hudson Bay outflow. For 9 straight days, the world shrank to the dimensions of a blizzard. The wind blew at a steady 40 miles per hour, a horizontal gale that shaved the fields to frozen bone. It picked up the scant snow and turned it into a billion tiny needles of ice, a scouring grain that sought every crack and seam in every structure built by man. The temperature plummeted. On the third night, the thermometer at Fort Totten registered minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 7th night, the mercury froze in the tube at its bottom mark of minus 50. The post surgeon, using an alcohol thermometer, recorded an unofficial reading of minus 59 degrees. With the wind, the effective temperature was something beyond calculation. It was a cold that killed. Inside the conventional cabins, life became a desperate, primal struggle. At the Finch homestead, the family abandoned all rooms but the kitchen. They stuffed rags, clothes, even pages from the family Bible into the cracks around the doors and windows. The ice on the inside of the walls was now an inch thick. The nails in the roof trusses contracted in the cold with sharp, pistol-shot cracks. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, and Abner Finch finally took an axe to the chairs in the parlor, feeding his ravenous stove with the remnants of his wife's dowry. Their world had been reduced to a small, smoky circle of misery around a cast-iron god that demanded constant sacrifice. Inside Bohdan Hrytsenko's pyramid, there was stillness. The 40-mile-per-hour gale hitting the sloped, burnished walls created not a roar, but a low, resonant hum like a giant's breath. The air inside was cool, but not cold, and absolutely motionless. A single candle flame on the table burned without a flicker. Katerina worked at her spinning wheel, the familiar, rhythmic sound, a comfort in the muffled world. Ivan and Oksana played on a sheepskin rug on the floor, dressed in simple woolen shirts, not their heavy coats. The proof of their impossible comfort sat on a small wooden shelf Bohdan had built into the inner wall. It was a small brass barometer he had carried from the old country. Each morning he would tap the glass. The needle would quiver and settle, recording the steady atmospheric pressure inside their sealed home. He knew from his years in the mountains that outside, in that maelstrom, the pressure had to be crashing, a sign of the atmosphere's violent instability. But inside his mud mountain, the air was its own placid country. The most remarkable evidence of their success was the most mundane. On the table sat a small wooden bowl with a pat of butter. In the Finch cabin, a block of butter was as hard as a rock. Here Katerina could take a knife and spread it easily on a piece of dark bread. This small domestic act was a profound victory, a testament to a warmth so complete it had become normal. On the 8th day of the storm, a patrol of 3 men from Fort Totten was fighting for its life. Led by Hollis Pemberton, they had been trying to reach the Finch homestead after a neighbor raised the alarm. They had lost the trail in the whiteout, and worse, 2 of their horses had gone down. A third had simply frozen to death on its feet. One of the troopers, a young man named Evans, was now functionally useless, his hands and feet wooden with frostbite, his mind beginning to wander. They were lost, freezing, and hours from any hope of rescue. Through the blinding ice-grained snow, Pemberton saw a shape, a low mound that didn't belong to the landscape. It was Hrytsenko's mad pyramid. He had no love for the structure, but any lee side was better than the open prairie. He half-carried, half-dragged Trooper Evans toward it, the other soldier, Corporal Ames, stumbling behind. They collapsed on the south side of the structure, out of the direct path of the wind. The relief was immediate, but insufficient. The cold was still overwhelming, a physical presence that sucked the life from them. Pemberton leaned his back against the rough, frozen mud of the wall, expecting it to be a block of absolute cold, another surface to steal his dwindling warmth. He braced for the brutal chill to seep through his thick army-issue greatcoat. But the cold never came. Instead, he felt something else, something impossible. Through the layers of wool and canvas, he felt a steady, deep, and undeniable warmth. It was not the heat of a fire. It was the gentle, penetrating heat of a banked oven, a warmth that seemed to be radiating from the very core of the structure. He pushed himself away, thinking his freezing mind was playing tricks on him. He turned and pressed the palm of his gloved hand against the wall. Even through the leather, he could feel it. Corporal Ames, seeing his commander's strange action, pulled off his own mitten and placed his bare, red hand on the cob. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir," he whispered, his voice hoarse, It's warm." Pemberton stared at the wall he had condemned, the wall he had sworn would crack and fall, killing the family within. It was not a block of ice. It was a source of life. It was a giant earthen hearth. At that moment, a perfect rectangle of yellow light appeared in the wall as Bohdan Hrytsenko opened his door. He saw the three desperate men huddled against his home, and there was no surprise on his face. He simply said, "Come in." The transition was jarring, a passage between worlds. They stepped from a screaming, lethal universe of white and gray into a pocket of profound calm and warmth. The air was still and smelled of wood smoke and cooking bread. Pemberton saw the two children asleep under a wool blanket in the corner. He saw the woman, Katerina, looking at them with quiet concern. His men, hardened soldiers, simply stood in the middle of the room, stunned into silence, their bodies absorbing the gentle, radiant heat. Pemberton's gaze fell upon the brass barometer on the shelf. He unbuttoned his coat and pulled out his own standard issue instrument. He tapped the glass. The needle didn't move. The ink inside was frozen solid, the delicate mechanism seized by the cold. It was a useless piece of metal. Hrytsenko's, however, was alive and well, its needle resting peacefully. Pemberton looked at the Ukrainian shepherd, a man he had mocked, a man he had threatened with official sanction. He saw no triumph in Hrytsenko's eyes, only a quiet, deep-seated competence. All of Pemberton's certainty, all his knowledge of angles and loads and seasoned lumber, evaporated in the gentle warmth of that room. He finally understood. "My God, Hrytsenko," Pemberton said, his voice full of an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe. "You didn't build a cabin. You built a piece of the earth." Hollis Pemberton became the pyramid's most fervent advocate. When the storm finally broke and he returned to Fort Totten, he was a changed man. He immediately went to the post commander and recounted the story, not as a tale of survival, but as a lesson in engineering. He requisitioned drafting paper and, from memory, sketched the design of Bohdan's structure. He annotated it with notes on the green oak, the inward settling principle, and the precise mixture and thickness of the straw clay cob. His report landed on the desk of the Department of the Dakota's chief engineer. The story of the patrol's survival, coupled with the startlingly low fuel consumption Bohdan reported, was too compelling to ignore. That spring, Pemberton's sketch was formalized and entered into Fort Totten's official winter shelter contingency manual. It was presented as an emergency structure, a way to create a maximally survivable shelter with minimal milled materials. The design, now officially sanctioned, began to spread. By the following autumn, the Hrytsenko Pyramid, as it was unofficially known, was included in plans for 3 Department of Dakota Army posts and 2 Indian Agency stations, from Standing Rock to Turtle Mountain. A piece of the Carpathian Mountains was now a part of the American frontier's institutional knowledge. What Bohdan Hrytsenko achieved with ancient knowledge and intuition, modern building science would not formalize for another century. His structure was a primitive but perfect example of a passive solar design, using the Earth itself as a core component. The principles he employed, high thermal mass, super-insulated walls, though his was mass, not insulation, and aerodynamic profiling, are the cornerstones of today's most advanced energy-efficient construction. Concepts like the passive house standard, which aims to create buildings that require almost no active heating, are the direct descendants of Bohdan's mud and log pyramid. He had no scientific instruments, no heat loss calculation software, only a deep, inherited understanding of how to survive in a place where winter was not a season, but a predator. There is a profound lesson in the slope of Bohdan's walls. The conventional frontier cabin stood in defiance of the prairie. It raised 4 flat walls like shields against the wind, a posture of confrontation. It dared the winter to do its worst, and for that defiance, it was punished. It was perpetually under siege, its heat constantly stripped away, its occupants forced into a desperate, fuel-intensive defense. Bohdan Hrytsenko built nothing of the sort. His home did not fight the wind. It yielded to it. It did not present an obstacle. It offered a path. It was a statement of humility in the face of an overwhelming force, an act of architectural diplomacy. He didn't raise 4 walls to be ambushed by the wind. He gave winter a slope to slide off of. If you learned something new today about the incredible power of thermal mass and intelligent design, please consider hitting that subscribe button and liking the video. It helps us bring more of these forgotten stories of ingenuity to light. And for our question today, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever personally seen or heard about? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical building practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. While the engineering and physics principles discussed are based on real-world science, any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.